we're just really excited and delighted to have these folks who are doing some really extraordinary things in their field, in their sector, to impact the world for the better. We want to take this opportunity to thank a few of our sponsors, our sponsors for our conversation today. Those are the City of Philadelphia, the Division of Housing and Community Development, as well as the John and James Knight Foundation and the Pennsylvania State Council on the Arts. We also want to thank you, our members, and folks that are engaged with our members and engaged at the neighborhood level doing some extraordinary work. You continue to delight and surprise and amaze us and continue to do your work in the face of great, great challenges. You continue to show us that compassion, kindness, and dedication are the capital, are the pieces of the capital that make our work so important and so valuable to so many. We're going to start in just a couple seconds, but I wanted to just do a couple housekeeping things. So the first is to let you know that after our conversation this morning, which will start very, very soon, we're going to have a sneak preview of our updated Collective Strengths Economic Impact Report. We're very excited to share this with you, our folks who've been walking with us on this journey throughout the conference conversations. You'll be the first folks to see a little snippet of the report. It will be joined by Lee Wong and Brittany Foreman of eConsult, our partners in crime, in helping us understand just how the dollars and cents impact of your work is impacting people at the neighborhood level, and broadly how it's impacting the state. This update of the report has been led by one of my colleagues here, Garrett O'Dwyer, who's been working tirelessly with a number of our members who repeatedly over the course of the last year or more been sharing their information and data with us that we can then turn over to eConsult for their number crunching. And we thank our members who really dug in with us to help us do this report. We think that you will be surprised and encouraged by the fact that this is not just, it's not hearts and flowers, it's real impacting work that's impacting people where it matters, in their pocketbooks and also in their communities. So please stick around for that. That's going to start at 11:45, and then at 12 noon, you can join us for 3 workshops that'll be led by some of the smartest people we know in the region. And there'll be information about those workshops and the links to those workshops in your conference, in your chat box as we get closer to the time. And with that, I am going to go ahead and get started and ask that our guests join us by opening up their video and their mics. So how is everyone doing today?
Great.
Feeling good.
That's awesome. That's awesome. We can't thank you enough for arranging your schedules to join us for this conversation. You know, like I said, I've been tracking Edward's work now since I read an article on your publication. You were interviewed by a New York Times columnist. I forget the columnist's name, but when I read it, I was shaking at the end. I couldn't wrap my head around what you were saying. I was like, what? And then the folks at Power, which is a faith-based coalition across the country of folks doing some amazing work at the grassroots level, invited Edgar to Philadelphia. I think it was last fall. He came to Rodef Shalom Synagogue. And I was like, again, gobsmacked. Like, what? This guy he's brilliant. Why isn't everybody like doing what he says? I don't understand. So it's taken me this long to try to track you down and get you to come, and not that you even knew I existed, but just trying to figure out a way to make what made sense in terms of bringing you to the table to talk to us, to share your insights. And of course, I know Dr. Otten because she is my professor at Salle, and man, she puts me through my paces. Anytime I think I can ease through a class, man, she's like, no. And she's the smartest person I know about nonprofits in terms of thinking about both their practical everyday, what they face, how they operate, but also kind of in the broader sense of, how this operates in terms of a management strategy, in terms of building strong organizations that are not just individuals, but part of a network of social supports and community supports that really are strengthening not just communities, but the country and really democracy. So I thought it was really important to have Dr. Otten here with us. And then of course the work that Nigel Charles is doing at the Bread and Roses Community Fund. I also was introduced at that conference at the Rodef Shalom Synagogue. Again, just blown away by the extraordinary depth of connection and commitment to figuring out, like, you know, how do we think differently about helping people, right? It's not just about writing checks, but thinking also about how do we coalesce power, how do we coalesce engagement. And I thought the Giving Circles was a prime example of some of the extraordinary work that's going on in the region. And I think is a real national model. So I thought it was really important that you all come together and make some mischief today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Edgar to start, and then we can go around to Dr. Otten and then to Nigel, and then we'll hop right on into our day. So Edgar.
Thank you, Pam, and it's so good to be with you guys today. Philly is a special place to me, so I love connecting with folks there any chance that I get. So in going first, this is the heat is on. Let's kind of set the stage for this conversation. I just prepared a few thoughts over the last couple of days, just sort of what I'm feeling in my spirit right now, and about the moment that we're in. And then, of course, I'm happy to weigh in and respond to questions that may come up. But, you know, we are living in a crazy time right now with what I'm calling a triple pandemic. Lots of folks are calling this moment that. Understanding that, of course, COVID-19 has swept the country from coast to coast and has upended millions of lives because of the government's negligent and dangerous response. Second, we are experiencing an economic fallout, millions of jobs lost, right? Lines of food banks growing day by day, and small businesses around the countries, many have closed for good. And we know that the impacts of that is disproportionate in communities of color. Beyond all of that, there is a third and arguably more devastating crisis, this pandemic of white supremacy that has infected our society so deeply that Black and brown people not only have endured devastating financial losses from the pandemic, but we are also being put in the hospital, and we're dying at rates far higher than our white peers. I know for me as a Native American, if you've seen the headlines, we are still fighting to flatten the curve in many of our communities. And for Black, Indigenous people, other people of color, we know that white supremacy has been a pre-existing condition that has exacerbated every other pain. But what I will say about this moment, where I feel like there's a collective exhaustion and really a national breakdown, there seems to be something rising from the ashes that is really beautiful to me. And this is a different type of solidarity that than I have ever experienced before, because I think everyone is beginning to understand that we must do something different, and that our suffering and our thriving really are mutual. And seeing the multiracial unity and solidarity for the movement for Black lives, the mutual aid funds, the memes, the tweets, how people are opening their doors to tear gas protesters, the millions of folks who have been on the streets night after night, really demonstrates for me that deep down, below our messy, dysfunctional national surface, there really is a human bond, a commonality where we know as human beings that we have to take care of each other, and that we can't rely on philanthropy or charity. We can't rely on this federal government. When push comes to shove, we all truly have each other. And it has taken a national crisis for us to see that. But it's been working. We know in the corporate sector, we've seen large companies branding Black Lives Matter and have been called out for not going beyond just a hashtag. We see that politicians in major cities have been forced to make commitments to defund the police and invest in our communities. And even in philanthropy, the sector where I work every day, which is always slow to embrace change, I've been seeing a transformation happening here. People have begun to realize that just giving is not enough, but we need to be redistributing wealth to the front lines for the fight for racial justice and using our financial power to heal centuries of injustice. In the book, I wrote one thing about uh, a challenge to foundations to think about 10%, a 10% tithing beyond the grant making, but looking at taking 10% of their endowment and handing that over to communities of color. And at that time, that seemed like a pipe dream, but now suddenly it's become a concrete reality with foundations across the country really thinking about how they might use their endowments and give funding back to communities of color as a form of reparations. And so, you know, I'm really excited about the moment that we're in, where we're looking at this philanthropic injustice where, you know, the highest year on record of giving to communities of color from foundations was a measly 8.5%. We know that that is no longer acceptable. The fact that 90% of foundation boards and more than 85% of executives remain white, we know that that's undemocratic. The fact that institutional philanthropy invests more money in Wall Street and harmful and extractive industries like private prisons is no longer acceptable. What we need now is truth, transparency, and reparations, understanding that the wealth that is found in the coffers of foundations was earned on the backs of people of color. And so it's now time for our communities to benefit from that wealth. So this is where I feel like we are right now. In a time where death is all around us, we are really, truly beginning to understand what really matters and to have a clear focus that we need to look critically at the past, not just to reopen wounds, but to acknowledge and to heal them. And for people who have lived with the gaping century-old wounds of white supremacy and colonialism for so long, we need a chance to heal. And for those who have never felt that pain, maybe until more recently, and who have benefited historically from the infliction of that pain, those folks need to ask, how can I be a part of this collective healing? What will I be willing to give up so that we all can heal?
Thank you, Edgar, very much. That was really powerful. Thank you. Dr. Otten?
So thank you, Pam, for inviting me, and for PACDC for doing this conference. And I'm delighted to be in such august company here. Edgar, you threw out my, not that I had prepared remarks, but I thought where I was going to go in this opening statement was going to be very different than where I am, because you talked about what you're feeling in your spirit. And so I want to share what I'm feeling in my spirit. I'm feeling a combination of anger and fear. My anger is that we, and when I say we, I'm talking about public charities, we waited way too long to push back on philanthropy. We allowed philanthropy to take our conversation and control our conversation. And it wasn't they usurped it, we allowed them to walk in. And so I'm feeling angry that we're at that point in history where we should have long ago started controlling that conversation, because we'd be in a much better place to the things that you pointed out than we are now. And we're having to now do some of the back work that we should have been doing in the previous decades. So A, we never would have gotten to the extreme where we are now, but B, we'd be better prepared to address what's going on now. But my fear is this, and I'm going to date myself, and I have no problems dating myself. I was on the grounds of the nation's capital when Martin Luther King made his I Have a Dream speech. And I was involved in all of those protests and marches and everything in the 1960s. And we thought we had done something. We thought we had moved the needle. And, you know, we thought that was the time. And I don't know whether it was arrogance or complacency, but we seem to have patted ourselves on the back and said, we've done it. And here we are, you know, 60 years later, and we didn't do it. And what my fear is that we're not going to achieve all of those things that you just mentioned, Edgar, all of those things that I assume we all, as part of this conversation, want to have happen, because somewhere along the way, people are going to get arrogant. They're going to get complacent. They're going to say, we've done it. And that's my fear. So that's both my anger and my fear. And that's what I'm feeling in my spirit. And not at all what I thought I was going to start out saying, but I'll end there. You asked for honesty, Pam.
Oh yes, you know that. You know, I don't get down with the whole sugarcoat. You know, with me, we tell it like a TI is.
No.
We tell it like a TI is. So yeah, our members don't suffer fools gladly, and so we need.
Exactly.
Yeah. So right on. Thank you, Doc, very much. Nigel.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to be part of this conversation. Really appreciative to PACDC, Edgar, Dr. Otten, really just in great company talking about what philanthropy is and what we can imagine it to be. And I got really excited. So if we're talking about how we feel, I get excited when I hear questions like this. Is it time to remake philanthropy? And I think in my mind jumps to that, similar to Dr. Otten, that it was time, right? And this is still a very important moment for us. I'd even love to expand the question and really think that like it's actually really time to remake our country, and philanthropy has to ask itself the question: do we want to be part, or do we want to be against really this remaking of our country? And that means there are a number of other questions we have to really seriously wrestle with and consider within our sector and within ourselves personally, to remake our country. I'll date myself as well, that I'm born in the late 80s, so I went through the 90s and everything was a remix, right? Every song that came out, you waited just a few more months for the remix to come out. And what we're looking at in philanthropy has been decades of remixing and never remaking, right? And remaking means that we have to strip it down. We have to dismantle the systems and the structures that are currently in place. And we have to be imaginative and really rebuilding and restructuring them in a way that works for everyone. And if we're talking about everyone, we have to ask the question of who has not been in the room. As Hamilton, the play says, like the room where it happens. Who's been in that room where it happens? We have to invite Black and Indigenous and other people of color. We have to invite LGBTQ people. We have to invite disabled people. We have to invite all of these people who oftentimes haven't been dictated to rather than brought into these processes. The truth is that change is happening. It has always been happening. It is constant. What we are seeing now in this moment is really the manifestation of labor and work that people have been putting in for generations. We are seeing it rise to the top in this particular moment. And really, we have to ask ourselves, are we going to respond? And how we are going to respond to this particular moment, and really taking down what has existed, what has been really our incorporation, our embracing of these white supremacist culture ideas, our manifestation of years of oppression and things like that. We have to really wrestle with those things and decide if we're going to do something different or if we're going to continue to relive the same realities.
Thank you, Charles and Nigel. I appreciate it. I'm looking at your the screen and it says Nigel Charles, and I always want to call you Charles, but that's your last name. I'm sorry. I'll make sure that I get that right by the time we're done. We have some questions. I know that there'll be questions from our audience, and what we ask folks to do who have questions, we'll take that at the end. But if you want to use the Q&A to type in your question, and I'll go through that, and we'll try to get to them once we get to that point. But and I have a bunch of questions because, like I said, I'm huge fans of these folks, and I think that the questions are reflective of a lot of the things that folks might be thinking of. So I'm going to move around a little bit, and I'm going to pose this question to everybody on the panel. And again, when Edgar had talked about like the 10% tithing, I was like, what? That's like, what? That's crazy, but also like brilliant. But then, you know, I wanted to do some like more research, like, well, what does that really look like? What could that look like? And so the Chronicle of Philanthropy came out this time last year with a report of a study that some of their analysis, some of their folks had done around the total assets of private foundations in the United States. They said that it's up somewhere around $1 trillion. Now that's as of last year, 1 trillion. And, you know, from my like South Philly, you know, background, you know, $1,000 is a lot of money. So when somebody talks to me about $1 trillion, that's 12 zeros. Like, what? What is that? So, like, I was astonished. So, but Giving USA reported in their 2019 report on 2018 funding for foundations in the United States that the total foundation giving at that time was about 75 billion, 1 trillion. So, and that's like 9 zeros, right? So yeah, I got that right, it's 9 zeros. So, so by my calculations, that was like 7.5%. And then Edgar, you talked about the 8%. So that's just 2% or so above, or now 3% above the federal IRS minimum requirement by foundations to give of their total endowment, right? Each year, endowments are required to give a minimum of 5%. That's a base, right? That's not like you have to do just that. You can do more, but most don't. Some do a little bit more, but not much. So that leaves, if I did like just as this back of the thumbnail, back of the envelope math, right? So if you took like that 75 billion away from 1 trillion, that would leave $925 billion or somewhere around that. So I'm like, well, damn, that's a lot of money left on the table. So I'm just wondering, like, what could we do to really kind of take a dig at that, as Edgar was referencing, like, you know, there's all this money that's left, right? Foundations have been giving more than they ever have, but they ain't given enough, right? Because there's so much left. And you said, as you all said, this is a unique moment. It's been building over time. So what can we do as the nonprofit sector collectively, and our actors that are partners who also are thinking the same thing? Like, how do we attack that? How do we, I don't want to say attack, that's not, how do we educate, and how do we advocate to access those resources better? And I'll open that up to everybody.
Well, I'll jump in for 2 reasons. Number one, I want to be clear that 5% mandatory isn't a mandatory give, it's a mandatory spend. And they can spend some of that mandatory 5% on their operating costs. So it's not they're giving away 5% of their assets. They have to spend it. So they might spend 4% on grants and 1% on operating costs, though I think it's probably different. And Edgar, you may have better numbers than I, but it's really important to understand that 5% is not giving. You know, there was, I think the last time it came up in Congress was maybe 6 years ago, when there was an attempt to say, no, that 5% must be 100% going out in grants. And the, you know, organized philanthropy foundations has a very powerful lobby, and they squashed that. And so we're still back to that minimum of 5%. You know, there is this group, the Charity Reform Initiative, that is going on and is trying to get Congress to pass a 10%, Edgar's 10% mandatory expenditure, but again, an expenditure, not a give. And I think that's really, really important. But I also want to broaden our thinking beyond organized philanthropy, because when I talk about philanthropy and when I think about philanthropy, and when I said earlier that we allowed philanthropy to take over our conversation and dictate what we should be doing, we being the public charities, I was including individuals as well who still have the majority of philanthropic dollars that are getting into nonprofits' hands. And so I just want to make sure we're thinking about philanthropy in the broadest sense and that we understand what that 5% is. The other thing that I want to throw out is that to me, it's not just spending more than that 5%, giving away more than that 5%. It's also using that corpus for those program-related investments and being able to use some of that 95% instead of self-sustaining, using it to give out to those who are trying to make these differences, to do the work that needs to be done. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to make sure that we all understand that what that 5% really is all about. Because if you've been, nothing against bread and roses, Nigel, I'm not talking about bread and roses, but if you've been to the offices of foundations around the country, their offices are generally much nicer than the offices of the public charities doing their work. So it's not like that 5% is minimally being spent on operating costs. So I'll be quiet now.
Yeah, I'll jump in. And the other thing to note about that 5% was that legislation, it took an act of Congress, right, to force foundations to actually move money into community. And that legislation was put in place before Nigel was born. So you shared you shared that you were a child of the 80s. So like around the time I was born in the 70s, that's when that legislation was put in place to force foundations to actually move money and resources into the community. I often ask the question, what is the net value of philanthropy? Because when you break down these numbers, like Pam, you said there's $1 trillion, which is correct, probably more now, because if you've seen the reports since the pandemic, the rich have gotten richer, right? No billionaire has become poor by starting a foundation or by giving away more money that actually benefits them and they become richer. But we look at this minimum 5% going out the door. Of that 5%, only 8% of the 5 goes to communities of color. So we're talking crumbs, okay, like small crumbs. When we're looking at the 95% that is being used to amass more and more wealth, how are foundations doing that? They are investing in Wall Street. The 95% is invested in private industry for the most part, aside from the few who do program-related investments and are using their endowments in a way to align with their mission. And what we know from research there is that the vast majority of that 95% is actually invested in harmful industries, right, that are like counterintuitive. Like every single day, there are foundations who invest in criminal justice reform through their 5%, but through their 95% are invested in private prisons, which makes absolutely no sense. There are foundations who are investing in environmental justice, but with their endowments are invested in fossil fuels, which makes absolutely no sense. So I think a start for nonprofits are, and changing this is actually to understand, to not be disillusioned by big philanthropy, right? To know that it is what it is, as Michelle Obama said, right? Philanthropy has a role to play. It has played a role and has done good work, but it is what it is. It is a major tax incentive for wealthy folks and corporations to start foundations. It serves them better than it serves communities. And so what we can advocate for is for wealthy people and corporations to pay taxes at a minimum, right? We can also, we also need to be careful about whose money we take and understand, where that money comes from. And do we want to be in bed with people who have earned money in certain kinds of ways? Again, it is what it is. I know that sometimes as nonprofits, we need the resources to make our payroll and all of those things. I know I've ran a nonprofit, but we have to be clear on where money has come from, what the values are that are attached to that. And there are opportunities to mobilize as individuals to push philanthropy to make changes. There's one effort that I'm involved in right now, the Charity Stimulus Package, if you haven't heard of that. It's a very simple effort where we're lobbying for foundations to adopt a 3-year payout of 10%, just for 3 years. Like, this should not be a hard lift for foundations to put new dollars into the nonprofit sector during this 3-year period. that we're seeing the demand on nonprofit services dramatically increase because of the pandemic. So that's a small thing that foundations can do, is to increase the payout. But we have got to find ways to hold foundations more accountable who espouse to be social justice institutions. Someone taught me a long time ago that foundations are not on the side of liberation. They are not here for us in that way. And I think that is in general pretty true, right? So we can't be naive about that. Although there are many funders who are working to support social justice and change that. I want to acknowledge that as well. But ultimately, as Laura said, and as I know, Nigel, you can speak to, money that is, we have to finance our own liberation. We have individuals who are the big slice of the pie of philanthropy. Giving circles, supporting through mutual aid is really going to be the way that we begin to close that race wealth gap. We cannot rely on these big foundations to bail us out.
Yeah, and I'll quickly chime in that I'm in absolute agreement with you two. I think we have to stop playing the minimums, right? We're expecting these big changes, but we support in these very minimum ways. We play the numbers. We actually do these calculations to make sure that we are hitting. If anyone's involved in a foundation, right around that tax time, right around the end of the year, you'll get a number of calls of people who are playing the numbers. They're trying to actually hit that minimum mark, but they're expecting maximum change within our communities. So one, we have to get ourselves out of the mindset of that and be really honest with ourselves about how we have been operating within philanthropy. And I would dare take it even a step further that with that honesty, we have to be honest that if we are not in this for change, then we should give it all away. And I know that's a big thing for our imaginations, but we should just give it all away, right? Because what we are saying that Edgar lifted up is that we trust Wall Street, we trust prisons, we trust all of these systems more than we trust Black, Indigenous, and people of color in leadership in these organizations. And we have to be very transparent about saying that we continually put our trust in the thing that has, done so much damage to our economy over and over again. We trust that so much more than we trust those people in their communities to actually make change for themselves. So we have to have honest, transparent conversations about what we're doing. And when we realize where we're standing, we have to be able to take bold action about that and really engage even our donors in different ways and start talking to them about, like, this is actually what is happening in the ways that you're giving, in the ways that you are hoarding power around the money and the resources. This is what the impact on these local small organizations is. Because the truth is, they've been over-delivering for generations when we have been giving them the minimum. And it's time that we actually honor and acknowledge the work that they've been doing and really start to give out. And there's some simple ways. I know sometimes we think very theoretically, but there's some simple ways. We can pay true cost, right? When we're thinking about their budgets and we're giving arbitrary 15% overhead rates, we can actually really ask them, like, how much is this program really gonna cost? We can step out of just giving programmatic grants and actually say, like, well, we're gonna support your general operating as well because you need to eat, right? You need to take care of yourself in this work. So there are actually some really simple ways that we can increase the amount that we're putting out into this work. But it starts with having really honest conversations.
But I would just want to jump on that. It also involves being willing to take a risk, because nonprofits, those public charities have historically been totally fearful to push back on philanthropists. And that's why when I say we've allowed them to usurp the conversation, we didn't push back and say, cover our true costs. And so we've now gotten into the habit of not telling them what our true costs are. And, even some don't even know what their true costs are. And so but to push back on a philanthropist and say, you want me to do this, but you have to understand, I'm working on the ground and I understand that this isn't what we need. This is what we need. And when you say this is what we need, you risk losing that money. And that is a huge risk that too few nonprofits have historically been willing to take. And what has to happen, it's not just we need them to spend more. And I agree with that. We have to increase the payout, but we have to help people find, I know this is kind of ironic to say right now, but find their voice that will in fact ultimately get them what they need, but perhaps in the short run, create a really, really scary scenario for them.
So I want to piggyback a little bit on that, Doc, because I've heard you speak in your classes and in your writing. You talk about, you know, I don't want to say the word complicity because you don't use that phrase per se, but we talk about like, you know, how private actors, how private foundations can, you know, look like they're trying to do good by investing in that good causes, but in reality, the good cause is really a cause that benefits them personally, or, you know, at the bottom line on some level.
Right.
And we know that books like Winners Take All and books like Revolution Will Not Be Funded, you know, speak to that. Like there's this weird like uncomfortableness, but that people get down with, right? So can you, I mean, and for us to kind of collectively stand on kind of like strong moral ground on that, nonprofits, and even some like-minded philanthropists, you know, what can we do to kind of be more intentional about what's already out there in the ether, right? People have fears, have some kind of icky feelings about that issue of like complicity, right? And it kind of takes away the credibility of advocating for like the value of advocating for what we're advocating for, right? Which is more resources, more collective engagement, more representation of folks on the ground. So can you talk to us about like how we can, the nonprofit sector in particularly, be thinking and acting in ways that are both mindful of that, but also working to kind of counter it as well?
So in the vein of transparency and honesty, I think we need to call people out. You know, what you were talking about and what has already been brought up, but not labeled as such, you know, so much of philanthropy is moral whitewashing. We're paying for our sins by patting ourselves on the back and feeling good about it. I mean, corporate social responsibility is great in terms of it produces money, but if it is the result of corporations trying to gain forgiveness for past sins or current sins that they, or future sins that they know they're going to happen, it's not good. And I want to go back to the point that Edgar made. All money is not equal. And nonprofits, again, it's that risk that Nigel brought up. We have to be willing to recognize that all money is not equal and not to take that money, because if we continue to take that money, then we are passively, and I would say passively, though in some respects it's actively, we are condoning moral whitewashing. We're not holding these companies to live 150% to their values. You can't say one thing and then do something else. You know, one of the things when I think about, you know, 5%, even 10%, even 15% is going to allow for philanthropists to self-perpetuate. And, you know, I think the whole sector, philanthropists, you know, private foundations, private individuals, public charities, I think we're all in that game of self-perpetuation. And, you know, I'm a huge fan of Thomas Szasz, who was a psychiatrist who wrote back in the last century. And he talked about the psychiatric profession as being more interested in self-perpetuation. And he pointed to the fact that when the DSM-I was first created, it was like this thick, and now it's like this thick. And so psychiatrists just kept coming up with more and more and more, you know, mental health diagnoses to keep them in business. And I look at philanthropy as that way, that we're keeping ourselves in business so that they have this option to feel good about the bad things that they're doing, that they can say, you know, I've done this good. one of the things I was reminded of when there was a story this morning about the Zuckerberg Chan's giving $300 million to voting rights organizations. And I remember, again, time starts to blur together, but whenever they created their foundation and the headlines were that the Zuckerberg Chans are giving all of this, a huge portion of their wealth to charity, and everybody thought, isn't this wonderful? They didn't give it to charity. They moved it from one place that nobody could have access to another place that they couldn't have access to. The growth of DAFs, donor advised funds, to me is one of the greatest sins that has been created in philanthropy, because if you want to talk about dark money, it is totally unavailable to all of those nonprofits. There's no directory. There's no ability to access that unless you know rich people who have a DAF. Well, how many people know rich people who might have a DAF? And so we've insulated, and I think I'm going off a little bit on what you asked, Pam, but I think my point in bringing all of this up is, I know my point in bringing all of this up is nonprofits have to be educated about the truth of philanthropy and stop worshiping at its feet, but understand what it is, what it's about, and being willing to call philanthropists out and say, you can't exist without us. So start listening to us, because we know more about what's needed than what you know. I'll stop. I'll get off that box for the moment.
No, and I preach, sister, preach. Right on. Edgar, you talk in your book, Decolonizing Wealth, about this separation worldview, which I really think speaks to like the elemental kind of the spirit of what's happening, I think, in a lot of philanthropies and I think in our world right now, right? Particularly in the United States. Can you talk about that when you were writing and as you were thinking about this? And can you talk about how you're seeing that unfold right now in this moment in time when everything is so stratified? I think people would appreciate learning more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the separation paradigm is not new, right? This is separation mindset is a byproduct of colonization. From the very beginning of colonization in this country, there's been a force that's been about dividing people, creating the us versus them division. This American idea of individualism is rooted in that as well, right? That we need to take care of ourselves and not others, and that we are inherently detached from each other and from this planet. That ideology is what allow things like slavery and genocide and the taking of land to happen, because people believe that I am not connected to these folks over here, that I am greater than these folks over here, or I've got to take care of me and my family, and that's all that matters. And so we still see that happening present day. I call it the Colonizer Virus, right? When you look at our public education system, you see that virus at play, right? Who has good schools, who doesn't have good schools? And this hoarding of wealth where we don't have a concept of what enough means. Like we need more and more and more, and that's coming out of this deep fear and this idea of scarcity and greed that again goes back to our history for colonization. People get so wrapped up in that you can even become violent, right? Because of the need to take care of oneself. This is why we can dump toxic waste in a river that's a few miles away from our home and feel like okay about that, because people think, oh, that's over here and it doesn't impact me, when we're all drinking from the same water. And so this is, I think, a fundamental mind shift that has to happen in our economic system, right? And it absolutely shows up in philanthropy, where we have a lack of proximity between the few people who hoard wealth and have wealth and start foundations, who are then funding those people over there, that they don't have relationship with, that they're not accountable to. Which to Laura's point, it's those are the people who know best, right? And I often say that people of color are the canaries in a coal mine. Like, we have experienced, system failure before and pain and struggle, and we know how to survive and to navigate those systems to take care of our communities. And that is the untapped indigenous wisdom that's in communities that philanthropy overlooks, that doesn't value, because it values you know, sameness. It values like intellectual capital coming out of ivory towers versus the intellectual wisdom, that, you know, the wisdom and the knowledge that's that is rooted in community. And so, yeah, it's a fundamental reason, I think, even now, like, just to put it in current context, when you think about you know, who's wearing a mask and not wearing a mask, right? Like, it's like, I see it everywhere that people are like, oh, I don't need to wear a mask because this is my personal right to not wear a mask, versus like not being willing to accept our, you know, our behavior, how it may impact the public health of others around us. And so it's a byproduct of the history of this country and how we were founded. And I think undoing that, decolonizing that, getting to a mind shift of understanding that we are connected to each other and to this earth is the only way forward that I can imagine to change this this system and this power play that is occurring.
So just picking up on that a little bit, Nigel, I want to talk to you or ask you about the work at Bread and Roses. And it seems like you guys are making some incredible headway, right? In terms of thinking about this work and trying to change methodologies in a profound way, right? Giving people with small voices access to bigger voices that are collective, right? To make action and have impact. Can you talk a little bit about that impact in terms of the giving circles themselves? And are you seeing the impact, you know, in terms of, you know, some new work that's being uncovered and advanced? Or I guess the question I'm trying to get to in a very roundabout way is, you know, it's all great to do and say we're all collectively donating, but we still need to get to the finish line in terms of solving for a problem or addressing an issue. Are you seeing that? Are you seeing those impacts within the giving circle in terms of their giving? Or is the impact more for Bread and Roses, the coalescing, the organizing power, the people power of getting people together to be thinking about this work, to work towards that bigger impact?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's both and. The truth is, connection in the work is necessary in all parts of it. So we have the opportunity through the Giving Project to bring in people who are different races, different class backgrounds, different ages. They're across all these types of differences, and they come together for a common purpose, right? Which is to support small organizations that are moving us forward towards justice. And at the end of their process, at the end of spending all of this time together, talking about what race and class is in our country, learning what grant making is, learning how to fundraise from their community, they're changed, right? Also making the decisions about where these funds will go. There is a personal change that happens within them. And because they experience that personal change in community, we find that many of these people stay connected for years and years to come, right? And that influences their giving, that influences the way that they interact with their families, the people that they ask for money. It influences that. And it also gives vital resources to those who are on the front lines doing this work, right? And those people are winning as well, right? Those people are being able to really have the funds that they need to do the incredible work that they were already doing, right? They were doing it without the funds, but now we're able to actually resource them, right? That creates like a feedback loop where people get to keep track of like this awesome work that these organizations have done and they were able to support, and it creates even more connection, right? So it's about connection all the way through, from the groups that we bring together, 20 people at a time, to the organizations that we fund at least 12 or so at a time, to the amount of donors that they bring in through these processes that they invite in. So it's about connection and really countering this idea that we can do it separately. One of the things that I say to the Giving Projects every single time when they come together, because they come in with a goal of raising $150,000, 20 people. Many of them have never fundraised before. to them, that may seem very impossible, right? So what I tell them all the time is it's only impossible because we haven't done it together yet, right? If we were doing it separately, then sure, I could close the book on it, right? But because we're doing it collectively, the possibilities really open up, and we can do some things that we didn't even imagine we could do separately.
So I'm going to follow that your comment up with this idea that I know has been circling in a lot of our communities across the city of Philadelphia, and I know they've been trying to do this in other communities across the country. I haven't seen it really materialize much in Philly, and so talking about like this giving circle idea in terms of folks getting together on a small scale, working on a key project. So could you talk about, like, if we tried to do something like that at the neighborhood level, let's say working, communities saying on one block where they know that there are families on that block, they need basic system repairs or roof support or whatever, but they all got together and collectively kind of, identified resources and pulled together resources. Could this work at a neighborhood revitalization scale? Because what you're working on right now is focused on social justice, but we in the community development sector see affordable housing and safe housing as a social justice issue. So could that work in our kind of platform?
Yeah, I think in many ways it can. So it may not be the exact giving project, but one of the things that we emphasize in our process of bringing people in is making sure that they take skills with them that they can bring to their own community. Mm-hmm. So yes, and I would say if we dare look through history, that communities have been doing this work for a very long time. They've been coming together and funding their own work because we've refused to fund them, right? So yes, I do believe that there are many lessons within the Giving Project that we do that people can take to their own community. For our organizations and our institutions, we can also take lessons from what the Giving Project is. The reason why I am always energized by the Giving Project is because we're forever learning from the people who are engaged in the process, right? So by bringing more people into the process, we're continually improving. And I know sometimes the Giving Project is talked about like leading some type of change, but really our communities are leading that change. We're responding to the things that they're saying. We're learning from them and we're evolving in those specific ways. So we're not actually the holders of all the information. Really, our communities have this information. They know how to move themselves towards a more liberated future. And we're just trying our best to be a responsive organization and using the Giving Project as a mechanism to do that.
But think about it, Pam. I mean, that was the original idea of a community foundation, to raise money from within the community to give to the community. But then, like so many things in our country, we think bigger is better. And so then community foundations became these massive things that lost focus on what they were all about. But so, what Bread and Roses is doing with the Giving Project, what you're talking about of, raising money within a neighborhood to leave in the neighborhood, it's what, as I said, community foundations were originally supposed to be about. There are some that still do that and do it really well, but so many of them have become these big philanthropists and forgotten their roots.
That's good. That's important for us to understand and know. Edgar, I had a question about your 7 signs of healing that you talk about in your book, which again, it is transformative, and I would encourage anyone who hasn't read it to please go out and get a copy of it. It is both I've been working in nonprofits now for all of my adult professional career, and I'm constantly learning new things. But this is some of the newest stuff that I've learned in the last year or so, and I think that everyone can learn from it. So you talk about in your work 2 of those 7 signs of healing is represent and invest. And I was really struck by those particular signs, because represent, as I understood it in your book, was about, folks coming to the table that were both the usual and the unusual suspects, but that folks at that table had agency and check writing ability that prior to now they didn't have. And then invest, like, diverse. I think you talk about, like, how foundations and philanthropy need to be thinking about how they invest in people. And that means, you know, bringing people on that don't necessarily look like the people who established the foundation. So can you talk a little bit about, you know, as it relates to that diversifying the sector on all levels, right? Can you talk about the represent, particularly and the invest pieces of your 7 signs? I think that, yeah, in this moment in particular, as folks are struggling with like, how do we, you know, have more people, brown people, Black people, all people, have a say in this? And you have very, very good people who are trying to figure this out, but they don't know how. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So in the 7 steps, I think understanding the previous steps, the earlier steps are very important to create the awareness and the conditions in an organization that will help with diversity, right? I think in this moment where we're having this racial justice moment in this country right now, right, where a lot of folks are jumping to respond, diversifying staffs is kind of the go-to, right? I get a call every week from search firms who are looking for that magical person of color, and diversity,
the magical nonprofit unicorn,
right? Representation matters, right? Diversity is super important in philanthropy. There is a direct correlation between who's sitting at that table making decisions and where money goes. I mean, that's a fact. And so we absolutely need to diversify at the board level, at the senior staff, level of all of these organizations. But I say that in the context of deeper, more transformative work has to happen. Foundations, especially, or organizations that are so deeply rooted in white dominant culture and ways of being and privilege, that they are places that are frankly challenging for people of color to work and thrive. And I've been in this industry for 15 years. And if you talk to me and any person of color who has worked in philanthropy for any number of years, you're gonna find common stories of difficulty managing and actually thriving in the space, because while we're jumping, and this is probably for the nonprofit sector at large, a lot of people are doing this, like jumping to bring on people of color, we haven't been willing to actually change the culture of our organizations to be to get at that inclusion and that equity, right? And we lump DEI all together, diversity, equity, inclusion, like it's the same thing, when they're so totally different things, right? We know that equity is about ownership, right? It is about power. And so, I'm really happy to understand that foundations are moving toward diversifying at all levels of their organizations. It is sort of something that even family foundations are thinking through very seriously right now. Hill Snowden Foundation just brought on non-family members for the first time. I'm on a board as one of the first non-family members for the first time. And so this is something that's happening. But we need something that's more transformative, and we as people of color have got to be thinking outside of this box, right? Like we need to disrupt, influence philanthropy in all the ways, but we also have to be, this is why I love the work that Nigel's doing, we have to be building our own thing, right? Because we've got to build our own wealth and philanthropic infrastructure to support our communities, because even though we get invited in to those spaces, we are often tokenized. And, when it gets down to it, when you're trying to come in, you might be hired for the way you look and what you represent and the networks you have. But when you come into this space, often you're going to be asked to leave that at the door. You're going to be asked to assimilate to another way of being, right? And often philanthropy, a critique I have is that I've been hired for what I represent and where I come from. But once I got in and was invited to the team, that's not what they wanted, right? They wanted to be able to check a box that they had hired someone from the South, a native, a younger person, whatever I was representing to folks at that time. And so this is where we run into this brick wall that diversity is just not enough, right? We need to completely transform every aspect of our operations as nonprofits, as foundations, to ensure that not only can we come in, but that we can thrive and lead in our own ways, and that is a way that is self-determined. So that's, yeah, so that is really important. So that's what Represent is about, but it is that pre-work that's also required, because 9 times out of 10, when I get that call from a search firm, I don't want to send my friends to work at most of these places. I have questions. Have you done the work to prepare for a person of color to be the first executive director there with your all-white board? Like that is a very challenging situation. And so that's what Represent is really about. It's not just setting a token seat at a table, but it's building a whole new table. And then Invest is kind of what we've been talking about in this conversation. It's about where are we moving our money, not just our grant dollars, but all of our money, right? What's happening in the endowment and with the investments. We need to be aligning all of those dollars toward the mission of our organizations, and not doing something good with our right hand while our left hand is doing something that's actually harming communities.
Thank you, Edgar, very much. I mean, I could be talking to y'all like for the next 2 hours or so, but I know that we have like a few questions. Actually, we have several questions, and I want to get to them. So let me, and I'm trying, y'all have to bear with me because I have to toggle back, and everyone who knows me, I am technology enabled. I am a Luddite. So y'all will bear with me. So we have one question here. And I think it's aimed towards the group. Can philanthropies invest their funds in a socially responsible manner, e.g. investing in BIPOC communities and not just wait to give grants from their investments? So I guess he means Black and Indigenous and brown communities. And that's from Dr. Drick Boyd, who was a professor at Eastern University. Hey, Dr. Boyd, I'm glad you joined us today. So can any of you take a stab at that question? I could reread it if you need me to. Hello?
Yeah, I'll just say that in terms of investments, some of the same challenges that we have on the grant making side, we find on the investment side, right? So foundations that are doing social impact investing with their endowments, which is much better than investing in Wall Street, right? It is more mission aligned. But often those impact investments are also not finding their way to Black, Indigenous, and people of color led organizations, because we have ideas of certain investments being risky, of people of color organizations not having enough capital. All of these challenges that prevent grants going to communities of color, we also find in the world of impact investing. We also find that lack of diversity. Most of the people who work in impact investing, it's even less diverse, right? Folks who work in wealth management, and when you think about the incentives that people have who work in finance, who are often the folks who are calling the shots around investments, they are completely upside down from the incentives that you might find with program people who are engaged with the community in the foundation. And often in the foundation, unless they're really large, you see that these two sides of the house, the grant making or the program side and the investments, are completely separated from each other, right? I've worked in 3 foundations now where the folks who are managing our investments, I didn't even know them. They weren't in the same building. They were wealth management firms, mostly white men who had zero analysis around social justice, right? And so their incentives are all about making more and more and more money, right? That's how they're driven. And they're not connected to the grantees or to the communities being served by the foundation. So I think that philanthropies have to tear down this firewall, right? There needs to be more connection between the program staff and the investment staff. We need to find wealth managers who have an analysis around social justice, who understands the mission of the foundation and what you're trying to accomplish. And then we have to completely reevaluate all of the decisions, how decisions are made in terms of investments, and reevaluate them from a racial justice point of view, right? Take out the traditional definitions of risk and those types of things that exist in the financial world in order to do the right thing, which is to move money to invest in, BIPOC-led organizations.
I would just add to that, you know, one of the things that we talk about all the time is this thing called those core values. And so, yes, there is this firewall between the program side and the investment side, but the whole organization, including the vendors that you hire, have to be guided by the core values of the organization. And if their core values are their core values are leading what they're funding, and their investment policy, which is framed by the board, should be led by the core values as well. There have been lists for decades and decades of socially responsible organizations where in which you can invest. Socially responsible has been not just what they make or what they invest in, whether they're clean for the environment, but also the diversity of the staff, the inclusivity of the staff and the board, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, being a socially responsible investor as a foundation is not hard if that's what their investment policy is driving them to. And so, you know, if you look at most investment policies and you know, Edgar, I assume you've seen many more investment policies from foundations than I have, but even just looking at the investment policies of the few foundations that I've looked at and the many that I've looked at from nonprofits, I'm constantly dismayed by the lack of evidence that their core values have framed what they're going to invest in, what their risk tolerance is, et cetera. It's like, to your point, Edgar, that's happening over here, totally separate from the purpose of the foundation. And that has to stop.
Can I add just like 30 seconds to that? And that the way that we have framed philanthropy in this very white supremacist culture ideology, it doesn't even work for us very well, right? We make decisions that seem risk adverse, but really the most risk adverse thing we can do is invest directly into BIPOC communities. There was a study done in 2011 by the National Council on Responsive Philanthropy. They found that every dollar that is invested into community organizations in Pennsylvania yielded $122 in actual results. We're not getting that type of yield on investments when we even do socially responsible investments. So the best way for us to actually get the biggest bang for our buck is to continually invest directly into Black, Indigenous, and other people of color organizations that are doing this type of change work. So that's work that foundations can do, but individuals, you can absolutely do that as well. You can give directly to these organizations, and that is really one of the most socially responsible things that we can do.
Thank you. So we have a question from an anonymous attendee. I don't know how that works, but I must be looking at it wrong. So I'll just read the question. It says, thank you so much for hosting this. I'm on the board of a small family foundation and have raised the issue of the 10% tithe. We support some amazing Black-led community-based organizations. If we decide to the 10%, I prefer to spend it all down. Do you have any thoughts on us just taking that 10% and giving more money to the organizations we already support versus finding new organizations? Is there a best practice on this thinking?
You know, I'll start with that. I think that there's not a best practice. I think the idea of foundations taking a chunk of their endowment and handing it over to people of color is a new thing, a new thought. You know, the idea of foundation spending down is not new. And I think I would absolutely support that as well. And you know, if you're a small family foundation, I think, you know, supporting the organizations, the Black-led organizations that you are currently in relationship with would be a fantastic way to go. Those organizations have been reliant on your funding. I think a spend down could look like, you know, what would it look like to actually create an endowment for that set of organizations, right? To divide that money up and hand it over to them. If you're gonna do the 10%, if you're not gonna spend down, the 10% is something that I know several foundations are thinking through right now as some kind of a challenge I put out there. Like, what does that look like? In the book, I just sort of, you know, put the idea out without a blueprint of the how, because I'm hoping that we can figure that out. But it could be as simple as, you know, taking 10% and again, going to those Black-led organizations and saying, we want to actually support your endowment take our endowment and make it your endowment, right? It could be something in that way. Other conversations I've had recently are trying to kind of think through what would it look like to actually create ownership of 10% of your endowment as a foundation by those organizations, and you still handle the investment part of that portfolio for them, because, you know, some nonprofits may not have the capacity to do that investment work, right? And so you might be able to still do that work on behalf of your partners, understanding that 10% of your endowment actually does belong to them. At any point in time, they can come and say, you know, we want our money, or we want this percent of our endowment this year for our budget. So this is a new territory, like a new thing. So I think we're going to have examples of folks who are trying this, so we can, you know, share back what works best for community. But all that being said, I think start with talking with your partners. Your partners know what they want and need, and say, hey, this is something we're thinking through. If we were to move this amount of money, whether it's all of your endowment or 10% of your endowment, how could we serve you through moving those resources, and what way can we serve you to sustain your work, or to respond to needs that you may have right now in this moment?
I'm going to answer that a little bit differently, and not that differently. So I recently read that if the HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, said that $40 billion would solve the homeless problem for the entire United States. And I started thinking, I did not do the math on this, unlike you did earlier, Pam, but I would wager a large amount of money that we have spent more than $40 billion over the decades trying to end homelessness, and we haven't. But imagine taking that $40 billion and giving it to one organization where that $40 billion was going to be spent just on ending homelessness, as opposed to, 50,000 there, 10,000 there. And I think to Edgar's point, talk with absolutely your grantees, but think about the impact that you want to have. One nonprofit, particularly small nonprofits, can do a heck of a lot more with 20,000 than 4 nonprofits are going to do with 5,000. And so it's that ultimate impact that you want to have. And that is the primary thinking behind spending down, that if we take a foundation that's got a large asset base, and we spend it in a concentrated period of time on a particular issue, we might actually make a difference. Whereas I'm increasingly thinking that, when we throw 10,000 here and 5,000 there, the best we can ever hope for are Band-Aids, as opposed to really, really getting at root causes and really changing and moving the needle. Just where my thinking is evolving.
So not to overstep Nigel, but there was one more question I wanted to get to before we wrap up, because I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and I just want to share that. So, and this is a really good question that I think speaks to what I know a lot of our practitioners might be thinking about. So the question is, who is responsible for calling out funders, nonprofit staff that are overworked and exhausted in advocating for their missions? So who has the power and time and resources to organize funders? That's actually a very good question, and I'm going to open that up to all of you.
I want to say funders have to step up. It is emblematic of what our racism problem in America is that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color didn't make this problem of racism. We fight against it, but we cannot actually make white people do anything. In the same way, our funders have to be able to step up. It is unfortunate that it is often on the shoulders of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color to step up and do that work within the organizations. But just like we're called on in America, on our whole country, to step up and actually do what's right, I think it's time for our foundations to start doing that internal work. And the truth is, what we act is like our foundations are oblivious to this. They know, right? They understand that these things are problematic, and these things have been named for a very long time. So I think it's been time for our foundations to step up and actually do this difficult work. But when we compare it to the difficulty of what many people's lived experience are in this country, it's actually not that comparable, right? It's not as difficult as we make it seem to do this work. And we perpetuate racism when we continually make it the job of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color to call it out. They still have to live in a racist world, and then they have to go to institutions that reinforce that racism and call out the racism. In many ways, it's just too much. It's too much to expect. And we need our foundations to step up.
So I'm going to ask Edgar and Dr. Otten to just quickly, share their insights on that question, and then we're going to go right into our wrap up.
I'll just say that totally agree with Nigel. The burden on politicizing foundations, educating foundations should not have to be on nonprofit leaders. It just shouldn't. Like, foundations need to do their own work, to own their own stuff in terms of how we've been problematic as an industry, and to self-correct. Now, I think that we all do have a role as we the people, right, in some of this change, because foundations are not going to get there on their own. Some will, right, but it's going to require some external movement, right? Like, we have to vote for increased taxation on wealthy people, right? We have to organize and demand transparency and accountability of these institutions, right? Foundations are a product of a public policy that exists that allows folks to have this big tax loophole, right? And the way that we function and our business practices are all, like many businesses are dictated by law. We have very few laws that require us to do anything. And so we can organize, and there have been public policy efforts to create some accountability for foundations. And so we can't be afraid as recipients of funds to actually take a stand as individuals to organize and support some of these policy change efforts, because I think it's going to require external pressure on foundations to actually make changes.
And I'm going to play, I think we, the public charities, have to be part of that external pressure, because I don't think they're going to do it on their own. I think we have to exert, and we have to find our own voice and push back. And as I said before, not just go, oh, almighty funder, I'll do whatever you want. We have to push back and demand that they change their ways, and that they think differently, and that whether it's giving more, whether it's just giving out operating grants, whatever it is, it's not going to happen unless we start demanding. And it goes back to what you were saying earlier, Edgar. It's about the separation of mindset. Funders are over here and we're over here, but we have to make them understand that we're all in this together. We're in a symbiotic relationship that has been really, really off kilter.
Well, with that, thank you, Dr. Otten. Thank you, Edgar. Thank you, Nigel. Yeah, you guys are freaking amazing. And I'm so glad that you were able to join together and share your insights with our folks. I know that you've given me a lot of food for thought in terms of thinking about how I'll be shaping some of the work that we'll be doing under our Community Development Leadership Institute training programs moving forward. I encourage you all to check out Bread and Roses Community Giving Circle and join a circle. I encourage folks that are really thinking about nonprofits and thinking about strengthening their nonprofits to visit Dr. Otten's Salle Center. It's one of the best in the country, and I mean, you can't go wrong going to the place where they know this stuff and they know how to strengthen, help organizations get strong. And I encourage everybody to get Edgar's book, read that sucker. I've been walking around with that thing. I've been got like my little tabs on that John, taking notes. But not just for the knowledge that he has in it, but also to help you organize your thinking and think about how it is you're doing your work. Sometimes we get caught up in our nonprofits, thinking about our individual work. And we're like, I got to get this individual work done. But the big problem we're working on still hasn't been solved. And so I just think that we need to think differently if we really want to try to solve these amazing, deep problems that are happening in our community, in our country. We can't do it by ourselves. We're not going to do it on our tiny little nonprofits individually, but collectively, collectively, there's nothing stopping us.